Good morning, everyone. I woke you up there. My name is Vera, and I'm very happy to be with you here today, this morning, to launch the Asian Infrastructure Investments Bank's flagship report on infrastructure for planetary health. And we have a fantastic lineup of speakers and panelists who will try to walk you through the different findings of this report. And I will also present a little bit more in depth of our findings and then give room to hopefully inspiring discussion and conversation on this topic. So with no further ado, I would like to invite to the stage our first keynote speaker, our president of AIIB, President Jin Lichin, to the stage.
Thank you, Vera. Thank you. Welcome. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to see a very interesting discussion. I also like to thank our chief economist, Eric, working with the team to propel this. This is really our great honor and privilege to launch the Asian Infrastructure Finance Flagship Report on infrastructure for planetary health at a time when our global health and finance communities face both unprecedented challenges and critical opportunities for progress. We have a very small team. As you know, our principle is be lean, clean, and green, and our economic department is very lean and working with other very lean departments. But the report they produce, I think I have the bragging rights, very, very rich in ideas. So hope we can also get your ideas to do better in the future. Talking about health, this is so important for all of us. Now, we went through very difficult years of COVID-19, which is now behind us unequivocally. But COVID-19 pandemic has left a painful, indelible scar on a lot of people, physically, psychologically, and definitely the scar could be seen in a healthcare system in many countries. Our economies and global health systems continue to bear these scars, making the achievement of the health-related sustainable development goals by 2030 increasingly difficult. However, the crises we face today go beyond the pandemic. Climate change, biodiversity losses, and environmental degradation are all deeply affecting human health and well-being. Billions are now at the mercy of extreme weather events, weather hazards, air pollution, water and vector-borne diseases, antimicrobial resistance, and emerging zoonotic diseases. These challenges strike hardest in developing economies, where they compound existing vulnerabilities and demand urgent solutions. The most vulnerable people are most susceptible to this kind of health hazards. The Earth, the planet, is certainly our home. But more importantly, the planet sustains our life. It's the life supporting system. As we build infrastructure to drive human progress, we must ensure that these systems promote health, protect nature, and mitigate the escalating effects of climate change. We humans have done too much damage to our Mother Nature. Too much. It's time for us to be keenly aware of the importance to take care of our Mother Nature. AIIB Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank was founded in the wake of the Paris Agreement. Mission to foster sustainable economic development, mobilize private capital, and promote regional cooperation and international cooperation. So at this critical juncture, we cannot afford to view infrastructure in isolation. And infrastructure should be defined in a very broad sense. 7 of the 9 planetary boundaries essential for maintaining life on Earth have been breached. The degradation of the biosphere, disruptions to the carbon cycle, and escalating air pollution threaten not only nature, but directly the human survival. 2024, the year 2024, is the first calendar year in which we have exceeded 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, a stark warning. Time is running out. And we see all these kind of phenomena. I have highlighted on many occasions, natural disasters are not really natural. They are anthropogenic. They are made by the humans. We would be victimized by our own indecent behavior. So it's time. By shifting infrastructure investments towards planetary health, we can protect the ecosystems that provide clean air, water, food security, and the resilience against climate disasters. Infrastructure is not just a functional necessity, it is the foundation of societies and economies. You know, our planet, Mother Nature, has huge capacity to renew itself. The pollution or degradation is our behavior has created problems way beyond the capacity of the earth to renew itself. And we have to strike a proper balance between our livelihood, and also the protecting of health. Planetary health is the prerequisite for the human health. We should never ever forget about this. Sustainable infrastructure is at the heart of the solution. Low-emission public transportation reduces air pollution and improves public health. Smarter water systems prevent disease transmission and ensure access to clean drinking water. Clean energy solutions reduce respiratory illnesses and premature death. Resilient healthcare infrastructure ensures medical services remain operational during climate-related crises. Nature-based solutions such as reforestation, wetland restoration, and urban greening strengthen climate adaptation while enhancing public health. A health lens is critical to our mandate of financing infrastructure for tomorrow. No nation can reach its full potential with a sick population on a degraded planet. This is not some of the scenes you see the science fiction. This is really happening around us. As the Chinese proverb wisely states, people have no money for health care because the money has been earmarked for their funeral. This is absurd. We must reassess our priorities and make our resource allocation more meaningful. We should not wait until the doomsday. The day of reckoning actually is approaching us unless we do something, fundamentally changing the way we live, we behave. I'm therefore delighted to announce the launch of our report on infrastructure for planetary health, the latest edition of AIIB's annual flagship Asian Infrastructure Finance Report. This report builds on our previous work, particularly nature as infrastructure, to highlight the essential role of infrastructure in safeguarding both human and planetary health. While our economic department, our economists have been putting their hearts and minds in producing this report, I should tell you, we are grateful to you for your ideas, your inspirations, which you keep feeding our economic department. I hope this kind of cooperation will go on. Since its establishment 9 years ago, our bank has worked to strengthen the intrinsic link between sustainable infrastructure, climate action, nature preservation, and now health. As we said, our bank, promote broad-based economic and social development through investment in infrastructure and other productive sectors. Healthcare is part of the other productive sectors, and only a healthy nation is productive. So when we talk about infrastructure tomorrow, which means this kind of investment on infrastructure is not what we've been doing over the last decades. It should be designed, implemented, and maintained in an environmentally benign way, environmentally constructive way. This is infrastructure for tomorrow. Our bank's approach to infrastructure for planetary health aims to maximize health co-benefits across all infrastructure sectors. Many of our projects, often co-financed with our multilateral development bank partners, such as the World Bank Group, ADB, EBRD, and AFDB, are designed to address the interconnected challenges of health, climate, and nature. By adopting a synergistic, sustainability-focused approach, our bank seeks to catalyze private sector financing and mobilize capital to meet the urgent needs of planetary health. A global planetary health response has the potential to unlock billions in funding from health and climate agencies, private investors, and philanthropic organizations. But this is not just about financial investment. It requires a paradigm shift in how we view infrastructure, health, and climate resilience in its totality. The One Health approach, linking human, animal, and environmental health, is fundamental to this transformation. Consider, for example, the decline of vulture population in India, which has led to increased diseases spread from scavengers like rats and dogs. This demonstrates how protecting biodiversity is integral to public health. Restoring nature is a health investment. Now, we should take this as our priority. Climate change and the environmental degradation are clearly the present danger we have to choose. Collaboration is essential. Nobody can handle all these issues single-handedly. Our bank is working closely with governments, MDBs, other MDBs, the private sector, and civil societies to enhance the enabling environment for climate, health, and nature investments. Our climate policy-based financing, which we introduced not long ago, is one way of supporting members in developing integral policies in addressing these complex interwoven challenges. We want to work with the governments to create an enabling environment for our private investors to do their business under an enabling environment. And this is what we said our cooperation is to pave the path for the sustainable investment by private investors. Finally, we must not forget these most at risk. Climate-driven health impacts would push millions back into poverty, push them back below the poverty line, and particularly in many developing countries. Women, children, the elderly, and marginalized communities bear the brunt of these crises. Investing in inclusive infrastructure, particularly healthcare systems and urban green spaces, can reduce health disparities, strengthen resilience, and ensure that no one is left behind. Supporting human health is not just about saving lives. It is about strengthening communities, safeguarding livelihoods, and ensuring sustainable prosperity for generations to come. The health for our offspring is crucial for the future of humanity. By investing in infrastructure for planetary health, we can break the cycle of environmental degradation and declining health, fostering a global community that thrives on sustainability, economic strength, and well-being. We are in South Africa. We are in Sub-Saharan Africa. We in AIB, don't be misguided by the title, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. We care about Sub-Saharan Africa. We care about the people here. And we care about wildlife here. This is the only continent which can show humans do not just do something selfishly. This is the only continent in which we could ensure that people's livelihood will continue to improve, and natural habitat for wildlife and other kind of species would be protected. And here you have the opportunity to show planetary health and human health are closely interlaced, and they can mutually reinforcing each other. This is the wonderful opportunity for us, and I'm hopeful that Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, will give us the role model. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. President, for, as always, inspiring words and for your relentless effort to always bring new perspectives of how we think about infrastructure for tomorrow. So with no further ado, I would like to invite our second panelist and keynote speaker to this session, one of the global champions for climate, Rachel Kite, the UN representative for climate.
Thank you very much. Mr. President, it is always difficult to follow you, but this is particularly difficult because your passion for this came through in every word. So congratulations to the team on what is really an extraordinary report. Thank you. So I'm wearing two hats talking to you today. I am the UK Special Representative for Climate, but I'm also a big fan of the AIIB and have been proud to serve on the International Advisory Panel in recent years. When the new Labour government took over in July of last year, the Foreign Secretary created two new positions, a politically appointed representative on climate and a politically appointed representative on nature. My twin, Ruth Davis, she's in Rome at the moment, sorting out the fragile consensus around how we will finance nature under the Convention on Biological Diversity. But the reason for appointing two representatives was because I think the Foreign Secretary's view is that if we put climate and nature at the heart of our foreign policy, we can reset the relationships, in particular with the Global South, or the global majority, in particular with Africa. So this report really gets to the heart of what would that actually mean, and how do we do that? How do we redress the imbalances of a humanity which has taken up too much planetary space over the last 150, 200 years? I do want to say an early happy birthday to AIIB. I think it's very fitting that an infrastructure bank that started in Asia, which is now global, would try so boldly to reframe what infrastructure development means for us at this moment in time. In much of the world of infrastructure, as previously conceived, we are struggling with the idea of resilient infrastructure. So continuing how we think about infrastructure development and then realizing that we now have to make it resilient. So continuing out decades of performance standards and guidelines and safeguards on how to make sure that infrastructure is developed quickly enough, but now how to make it resilient to 50 degrees centigrade for weeks on end, to extraordinary flood patterns, to extreme weather, and to the burgeoning needs of growing populations of young people that need that infrastructure to meet their basic needs. Remarkable work coming out of emerging markets and developing economies is continuing. So I think of India's commitment behind the Centre for Resilient Infrastructure Development, in service now to many other developing economies. So this is all very important and needs to continue. But at the same time, this mindset shift, which we can read in this report, has to come alongside the way we think about the infrastructure build-out that is necessary. And I think this is a real challenge to the way that we do development. I was recently in the United States, where my family still lives, even though I've relocated to London. And I went into the supermarket, and the normal dozen eggs that I would buy was $18. Now, I was home in the United States at Christmas, New Year, and eggs were about $6, $7, right, which was a little expensive, but, $18 for a dozen eggs. $18 for a dozen eggs because of bird flu. Bird flu because of the way in which we don't yet manage our relationship with nature. And it struck me that just a few years after a global pandemic, which was so dislocating, and with the dislocation of which we're still only beginning to understand, in particular the dislocation to the education profiles of the next generation and to the mental health of the next generation, that just a few years after, while we try to reckon with the fact that the United States is now going to import eggs from Turkey, we have to deal with a situation where we have started to defund across the developed world the infrastructure that we were putting in place to cope with the pandemic. So the faddism in development is still there. And at a time when, of course, we're now experiencing a set of cuts, necessary cuts in development spending in order to meet our defense needs, but at a time when we have to find a way to do better and do more with less. So how we bring this conversation around this kind of thinking around infrastructure into a debate not only with the existing development industry, much of it represented here in Cape Town over the last few days, but also to the private sector and to our understanding of how we must value nature in our economy is fundamentally important. So I took 5 things away, maybe 6, from this report. First of all, read it, all of it, not just the executive summary. It's well worth it. So my takeaways, that the focus has been for the last few years on the transition of the financial system and the energy systems. But we really need to catch up with the transition of the food system. And these 3 have to be coming together if we're going to be able to respond to the intellectual challenge that's laid in front of us by AIIB in this report. The second is that there is a fundamental challenge to the way that we do development, not just to the MDBs, but also to development finance institutions and national development banks. We are siloed in the way in which we think about development. We are fragmented in terms of how we organize the technical assistance and the finance. And in many of the sessions here on country platforms, we are still prescriptive. So if it is true, and it is a very important point that the President made, that this is the continent where we haven't paved over nature yet. This is the continent where we have a chance to celebrate the hyperpower of renewable energy, the hyperpower of mineral resources, but also the hyperpower of nature in order to sustain prosperity of a very fast-growing youthful population. The lessons are going to come from this part of the world, and then hopefully developed countries can learn things from how we do things here. I mean, in the UK, we have to invest massively in our flood defences at a time where our growth is, around 1%, and at a time when there's competing needs for that growth. We also know that a walk in nature will help a teenager's mental health, but that nature is very far away from many of our young people. So it is here that we must look for inspiration, which is not the classic development model. Thirdly, we have a very important confluence of the conferences of parties of the Rio trio of conferences from 1992. We find it very easy to talk about climate in a biodiversity convention. We have found it impossible to talk about nature in climate convention negotiations. We will have to find a solution to that in Belém in November. And of course, Brazil has come out with some very large and ambitious statements about how we start to value nature. And we will have to find ways to mobilize our sovereign wealth behind the value that we get from protecting nature while building out the infrastructure that people need. I'm glad that yesterday in Rome we made a small step forward in a small compromise on how to mobilize funds for nature. But missing in that was the fact that this is the smartest thing to do with our investment because of how it protects our own human health. So we still talk about nature here, we talk about health here, we talk about infrastructure over here, and we talk about climate resilience over here. And I hope that this report will help us bring together those conversations. The fourth thing I took away is that MDBs lead. In a world where there is less financing coming for development investments, the efficiency and the effectiveness of the MDB system is really a fundamental crutch, really, for these few years of low economic growth in many parts of the world. And the intellectual leadership is coming from across the system. It's not just coming from institutions based in Washington. But how then we support institutions to have the political space to experiment is really important. And what I take away as a major shareholder of many of the MDBs in the system is that we have to allow the MDB system to really experiment. And when you experiment, not everything works. And we have to create the political space for that. We were the first G7 country to join AIIB, something that we're enormously proud of. And I hope that we will find a way to support AIIB to really try to implement some of the boldness in this report. The fifth point I wanted to make is that this report will also be very important to us because we've seen a weaponization of net zero in recent years coming from different points in the political spectrum globally. There are reasons why net zero is being weaponized, and that's about incumbency and inertia of the systems that protect those who do well at the moment. But we know that when we talk about our children's health, when we talk about access to clean air, when we talk about access to clean water, when we talk about safety coming from flood defences, or education and health systems that can operate under extreme heat, that's what people want. That can't be weaponized. That's what people want. But we have lost control of a narrative about that's what it means to wrestle the climate crisis and to stop the war on nature. The final thing I wanted to say is that I was struck when I read the report, and struck in particular by listening to the President, was about the irony of those who are most vulnerable. Those who are most vulnerable are living in the parts of the world where nature is richest. And our economic system has failed to allow them the benefit of the prosperity that comes from living that close to nature. In my country, those who are the most vulnerable have the least access to nature. And so I think we need to go away and start thinking about, in a time of crisis, In a time of economic tumult and political instability, can we cleave closer to nature in order to find a way forward? The UK would be happy to be a partner with you on that pathway. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for those very inspiring words. So if it was hard to go after Mr. President, now I have Rachel as well, so even harder. But I will try to use a little bit of time here to talk about the findings of this report together with my colleague Zhang Ping, and try to walk you through a little bit of what this report actually shed light on, and a little bit about the more sort of detailed of the aspects of why this is such a critical issue at this time. So we mentioned before, and previous speaker mentioned before, the accelerating effects of climate change and nature degradation and what it does to human health. We know that it affects all of our organs in our body, leading to respiratory diseases, leading to cardiovascular diseases, leading to diarrheal diseases and so forth. And the interesting thing is when you think about health, actually, and when you think about safeguarding health, you think about the healthcare system. You think that, you know, having access to medicine or to hospitals is the most critical aspects of actually safeguarding health. But only about 10% of what safeguards our health is due to access to medicines or to healthcare facilities. All the rest has to do with having access to clean water, access to clean air, education, and so forth. So it's critical to think about health through a sort of, you know, beyond the healthcare sector and how we can improve that. I think many comments were said before as well on, you know, who are the most affected in this situation and in this crisis. And we know that people living in poverty, vulnerable groups, especially children, women, and the elderly are most affected, whether it's to heat stress or to floods or to rising increases in vector-borne diseases. It is important to build a resilient healthcare system, but it's also really important to think about all of the critical infrastructure that supports health. So AIB is an infrastructure bank at our core, and we operate now also in the social infrastructure space with health and education and other productive sectors. It is very important to realize that these different sectors, whether it's energy, transport, water and sanitation, has enormous potential for human health. And it is critical that when we build infrastructure, we lock ourselves in for maybe decades, maybe centuries, and the importance of getting that right from the outset. And I think we spoke a lot about, you know, this particular continent where a lot of the critical infrastructure is not there at the moment. So how do we actually get it right from the outset? That's also what we're trying to shed light on in this report. And this report is the continuation of two previous reports that the bank produced on the net zero transition and the latest one on nature as infrastructure. So I will give the word now to my colleague, Zhang Ping, to walk you through some of the findings of this report.
Thank you, President. Thank you, Ambassador Kite and Chief Economist Richard, Eric, and also Vera. Let me quickly walk you through some of the findings of the report. Now, I have seen the report many times, hundreds of times, gone through every chart, but this chart, I've done many regressions, but this chart remains the most striking one of all, and I will single this out. I will say in more details later. If you look at air pollution measured on an x-axis, and you look at mortality measured on the y-axis, right? Blue dots are the high-income countries, red dots are the lower-income countries, developing countries. The bubbles are the size of the economy. Look at pollution, look at air pollution. It has virtually no impact on the mortality outcomes of rich countries. But for the same level of pollution, you see the mortality spikes upwards for developing economies. It takes a long time, it takes a little bit to breathe, and it's sinking, right? So in the high-income economies, there are private sector solutions. There's air conditions, there's air purifier. The healthcare system is much better. When you have respiratory disease, you go to healthcare, it is there. It is not the same if you are in an open space, breathing in a kind of a polluted air in your house, in a workplace, in a public transport. Now let that sink in. It's so important. In India, because of the air pollution, the government also imposed some control measures, economic control measures, in the New Delhi capital regions. That gave us a very good kind of a policy exogenous shock where we carried out indifference analysis and comparing the outcomes against other Indian cities. It was a natural experiment that we leveraged in the report to do the study. And guess what? There are real improvement in Delhi when those controls are imposed to reduce air pollution. Let me give you a high-level number. About 6,000 infant mortality, 6,000 babies were saved as a result of those control measures. And birth weight also increased. However, I would like to stress this. Economic control measures to cut air pollution is extremely costly for the people, populations, and jobs. Ultimately, fundamentally, it lies with improvement in the infrastructure to fundamentally improve air quality as opposed to this kind of economic control measures. I have lived in China for 10 years, and I have seen the improvement in air quality. The journey has not always been even, but the journey has been one of improvement. When China first started retiring the coal plants, so the air pollution of these plants around this area, it dropped. But somehow, because of the need to generate energy, another coal plants get fired up, and the air pollution shifted from this place to another place. So that was the initial years. But through better investments in renewables, through better inter-province transmission connectivity, and more importantly, policy incentives to encourage province leaders to trade electricity, that gradually improve the situation and genuine gains are seen. I'm not saying all is perfect, there is still air pollution, but it is already much better than we see 10 years ago. Again, this points to the importance of policy measures plus infrastructure. Let me highlight now, move quickly to water. It is very clear, like for many of the speakers, that water is going to be a key issue because of increased flooding. And it is very clear, using oxygen, dissolved oxygen in the water, you can test out the water quality. You can find out the water quality. Again, the blue dots are high-income countries. Not all high-income countries have good water systems. Some of them have polluted water systems as well. But again, even though the rivers are polluted, the water at home is managed. Therefore, there is an insulation of the direct transmission of the polluted water to the health, but not so for developing economies. A lot of them are rural, have large agricultural sectors. They're exposed to water pollution all the time. If we flood, we have studies that shows that, again, after floods, the incidence of malaria disease, incidence of diarrheal diseases go up. And 1 week ahead of the International Women's Day, I just want to reiterate the fact that waterborne diseases affect women disproportionately because of the way the job's nature, the household chores, need to collect water, exposure, and so on. Let me quickly touch base on nature. Again, you see that when nature is degraded, right, the largest impact, the largest negative impact falls on developing economies. So President mentioned about the instances of vouchers. Actually, the scientists already knew that the vouchers started dying 20 years ago. 2004, the papers already started to come out. But it was only recently that economists made that link from the disappearance of the vouchers in Indian states to the health outcomes and documented the effects of that on mortality. 100,000 deaths, extra deaths in India. Now, per year. Now, why did this voucher die off? I don't know whether you know. It was the accidental release of a farm antibiotics through the food chain into the wild. Again, it shows that when you have some interaction with nature, you have to be careful, you have to take care, you have to not allow human activities, agriculture, and so on to interfere with nature. It causes a lot of damage in the end. Again, I want to stress that 3 mega regions are so important for nature. Southeast Asia, I'm talking about the Borneo, the Sumatra, and the Papua. Amazon, we all know. and fundamentally also Africa. President mentioned this. This is why it is so important for AIIB to connect with all of you on these regions. It is so important. These three regions are critically important for planetary health. Let me quickly talk a little bit about inequality and its effect before I hand over for Vera to finish up. So, inequality will have a difference, will make a difference to healthcare outcome. A little bit for rich income countries, but a lot more for developing economies. And let me explain why. Think about heat waves, right? Heat waves are extremely uneven. It makes a big difference whether you live in an air-conditioned environment or you're living under informal housing with a co-regulated iron roof over your head. It's a big difference. Our economists documented that when you have access to electricity, the mortality that happens during a heat wave is lower. When you live near green spaces, the mortality during heat waves is lower. When you live near hospitals, the mortality during heat waves are lower. So all these are the effects of infrastructure. I'm not suggesting that everyone should switch on their air cons during the heat waves, but at least in the short run, we know the connection exists, and it's important that sustainable infrastructure is there to provide the kind of protections against the worst effects from affecting the most vulnerable group. Let me say that there are many, many others of these studies in the report. I can't do all of them justice. A great thanks to all the economists back in HQ. Please download the report and read it in detail. I'm happy to hear your views later. I pass the floor to Vera to conclude. Thank you so much.
Thank you, JP, and hopefully that gave you a little bit more insight and a teaser to the report, so please download and read. So I will try to conclude. Let's see, I'll skip through all of them now. Sorry about that. Oh. There we go. So what are the findings and how do we think about this report and the findings of this report? So we came up with 3 areas where we see critical importance of investments. The first one is actually the healthcare system itself. We just had in December last year our first health strategy for the bank, and we are very excited to say that many of these aspects on climate were incorporated in, and nature were incorporated into that health strategy. We have almost $5 billion already in our health portfolio, and we hope to grow these projects moving forward. But the healthcare system itself, as it is now, it's actually a rather big polluter. It accounts for almost 5% of the country's CO2 emission. So there's a lot to be done in the healthcare sector itself to make it more green, resilient towards these extreme weather events that we spoke about, more inclusive, making sure that the people who have least access to the healthcare services have better access to healthcare services, while we invest in these critical services. We have already a couple of projects that really highlights these type of approaches, such as the mega project that we have in Indonesia together with the World Bank and Asian Infrastructure Development Bank. The second part is looking beyond the healthcare sector. So a health in all infrastructure approach, or health, nature, and climate in all infrastructure approach. And that is really to speak to the different sectors that we invest in, whether it's transport. We don't only want to mitigate, excessive mortality in the roads. We want to make sure that those roads facilitate better access for communities, incorporate green solutions to deal with climate change, and incorporate solutions to maintain and conserve nature. The third one is to look at nature-based solution and nature as infrastructure. And this is really to optimize how we invest in nature, and really leading to the report that we have done last year. But the interesting thing is that we know very little about what actual ecosystem services do to our human health, but there's an increasing pool of knowledge and research in this space. And we need to invest more in nature to safeguard our own human health. So I will finalize and give over to the panel on our key recommendations. First, adapt a planetary health paradigm approach. Second, invest in nature as infrastructure expand inclusive healthcare access, strengthen global collaboration, and I think this is so critical, and this is why we're here today. Not only MDBs, but public development banks, other financial institutions, we all have a crucial and important role to play in this. And finally, close the financial gap. We know that there's a huge financial gap when it comes to health. There's a huge financial gap when it comes to climate and nature. So by looking at a more holistic approach, we can mobilize more funding to these sectors in a holistic way. So I will stop there because I want to have enough time for our fantastic panel to discuss and reflect upon both the findings of our report, and we are hoping to save a couple of minutes or 10 minutes in the end for Q&A, so please stay tuned. So with that, I want to welcome our fantastic moderator, Barbara Bushner, who's the Managing Global Director of the Climate Policy Institute, to take over this session. So please, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you so much for having me here. And what a wonderful way to start this panel. I'm very inspired by our keynote speakers. I think it's been very just remarkable to hear the passion that is, and all the work that has been going into this area. Planetary health is a precondition for human health. This is not science fiction, as President mentioned. We need to reassess our priorities. We need to focus on the opportunities to unlock finance at scale, but it's not only about finance, it's really mostly about a paradigm shift, about a mindset shift. And in that context, collaboration is essential. Today, we are bringing together a fantastic set of panelists, experts that will explore this critical intersection between climate, health, nature, and infrastructure financing. But most importantly, about how can we take action to really accelerate the finance on the ground and really make sure that we are building a more resilient, a more sustainable, a more inclusive future. And I think the keynotes, and thank you, Rachel, for that, already provided 5 ways of thinking about the opportunities there. So I hope we will be going deeper into some of those. I do want to echo Rachel as well. I think this is a fantastic report. Congratulations to the whole team. Full disclosure, I actually am one of those who've only read the executive summary, but after having heard all the presentation and Rachel's clear takeaways, who I know has read the whole report, I promise I will read the whole report as well, and I'll make my whole team read the report as well. So we will be sure that we will be distributing and increasing the visibility of this important piece of work. But with that, let me invite my panelists on stage here so we can get started. I'm very happy to have with us here today Maria Neto, who is the Executive Director of the Instituto Clima y Sociedad, IX. Please join me here. We have Olivier Ray, who's the Executive Director of Mobilization, Movement Cooperation, Communication and Partnerships at the International Committee of the Red Cross. Great to have you here. We have Hoon Kim, who is the Acting Vice President, Investment Solutions and the Director General of Sectors, Themes and Finance Solutions Department at IIB. Wonderful to have you here. And last but certainly not least, we have Eric Bergloff, who is the Chief Economist of AIB and a very good partner in lots of the work we do. And I'm going to join you at the table. Wonderful. So, is this working? It is. It now is working. Yeah. Very good. Well, I think we've had lots of inspiration through the presentation of the report and the keynote. But let me start actually, Maria, with you immediately. Brazil has been very active in this space, in the infrastructure space, in the nature space, and really trying to also pioneer and experiment with new financial instruments in this space, including with green bonds, but also Planet Finance to really drive sustainable infrastructure. I'd love to hear a little bit from you what you think about the role of these types of instruments, but also how can they really bring together this nexus between health, climate, nature, and infrastructure. So over to you.
So thanks a lot. First of all, thanks for AIIB, another opportunity here to be commenting another actually really interesting report. The 2 years ago, we had the report on nature-based and infrastructure, now the health. I think it's super interesting how you are provoking to look at infrastructure in a different way. So thank you for the initiative, and very happy to be here to comment on it. A couple of things I was just taking from the conversations we just had that I think are important also from my role as philanthropy. We were talking about, towards the end, the question of inclusion and the different impact depending on the levels of, wealth of different people. And if we take, for example, the situation in Brazil, we are having increasing number of heat waves, for example, but clearly the heat waves have much worse impact in health and quality of life of poor people than it have in actually people who have better quality of life. So there is a huge question here on how we start rethinking this, and I taken a bit what and Rachel was talking in terms of we always kept thinking about resilient infrastructure. It's almost as we were worried about the infrastructure itself being resilient, not disappearing, but what is about the planning around the infrastructure to be part of the solution as well. So I think what is very provocative in this conversation here is not just about thinking about how the infrastructure is to be more resilient. I myself, I participate in the coalition of disaster risk and resilient infrastructure, the CDRI, and they have a wonderful work being done. Actually, there'll be a report about finance and actually resiliency. And I was this week actually participating in a conversation with them. And there is a lot of discussion on how we look at the infrastructure to be more resilient. But what we are talking here is about also how we plan the infrastructure, not only to be more resilient, for example, to the environmental and climate impacts, but is how the infrastructure itself becomes part of the solution. So when we are talking about heat waves, it's not only about how we plan the housing, for example, in poor areas to be better designed, but it's also how these houses may have, for example, nature or other kind of solutions that could improve the life of people there, and how we also plan these to be part of the local planning of a city on what is the reduction, for example, of costs for my own health bill. So I think this integrated understanding and approach is an important thing that is brought from this conversation here. So I want to talk about that. And then, Barbara, you were talking about a bit the financial solutions. I think this is also an interesting approach that if we start looking at infrastructure more positively, not just looking at the impact from the point of view, which we have to as well, of course, the resiliency and the cost of the cost benefit. That's what we are talking in CDRI this week. How we do tools for cost benefit on making the infrastructure more resilient, but also how we look at the benefits from the solutions that I could add to the planning. So I think the key thing here is if we can look at that and do this analysis on the benefits and start demonstrating these KPIs, how by doing this new way of, for example, planning an urban zone with social housing that is not for the government, just the cost of subsidizing social housing. It's the benefit socially, of course, for the people that are benefiting from the social housing, but maybe also reduced cost for the same government. And when we are talking about the financial instrument, maybe there are incentives that you can use for that. And so I think building in these KPIs, there might be very different ways on where a development bank, since we are here talking about the role of public banks, to be able to finance, for example, these things, considering a lot of different returns in addition to the ones that they should have as development banks. There might be also cost and financial returns from these strategies. So I really congratulate the provocation here and the new way to think about it, because we have to think, as Rachel was talking about, resilient. We have to think about the nature. We have to think about solutions for health. But actually, the challenge is to look at that as a system issue and how we can actually, by improving one thing, benefiting the other as well, and not necessarily look at everything as cost, but a cost opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria. Extremely important, I think. It links to lots of conversations amongst public development banks about how you focus not only on also like quantity of finance that goes to specific sectors, but then the impact and the quality of it. So I think it's more holistic, the KPIs that you've been mentioning, thinking more holistically and integrating more positively, I think, the impact of infrastructure also on health and on communities is a very important part. So thank you so much for that. But Olivier, let me come to you. You obviously have a lot of experience in global affairs and humanitarian responses where needed. So I'd love to understand a little bit better how the international community could better align humanitarian responses with some of the long-term infrastructure investments to make sure that we build a more sustainable future, and particularly I think in the areas that are very affected by crisis.
Yes, thank you for this fascinating conversation and this very important report, which resonates very, very strongly with the experience of our colleagues. You may know that the International Committee of the Red Cross is present in about 100 countries throughout the world. And our experts register over 120 active conflicts worldwide. And that is 3 times more than just 3 decades ago. And we do trace some of the causality back to some of the issues, intertwined and compounding crises that we discussed this morning. And so we fundamentally share the recommendation of the report that we need to be rethinking the infrastructure investments in these contexts. Why? I would say it's because of a twin paradox. First, as the report shows very well, and this is well demonstrated today, the world's poorest communities are the most exposed to climate and health risks, but they also have the least capability to cope with the consequences. And that is particularly true in times of conflict, whether you look at Afghanistan today, some parts of the Sahel, or the Horn of Africa. Now, the good news is that it is possible to de-risk infrastructure investments, even in some of these very fragile contexts. We're now well beyond the proof of concept in partnerships that we have with public development banks like the World Bank or AFD, but we'd like to take this demonstration to scale with other partners moving forward. And I'd be happy to give a few examples of how that is being done in Goma today, in Beirut, or in Mosul. But the second paradox is the following. I heard a lot over the last few days about how to mobilize the missing billions or trillions to plug that infrastructure gap, and that's a fundamental conversation. And yet, we're not doing what it takes to protect these critical investments from shocks, be they severe climate events or, in fact, violent conflict. Now, what is it worth to plug the financing gap if hospitals, if health centers, if the systems, the electricity or the water systems that provide these hospitals are the first targets of war? Now, whether you look at Kharkiv, Khartoum, Raqqa today, we understand that the world just cannot afford the costs of reconstruction if we keep along this trajectory. The World Bank estimates that in Gaza alone, the cost of reconstruction is over $50 billion. Now, our analysis is that the most cost-efficient infrastructure is actually the infrastructure that exists today and that is at risk of destruction or, for that matter, collapse for lack of being sustained because of conflict or sanctions. And that's the second piece of good news, is that there are binding legal rules that actually protect not only critical infrastructure, but also nature, even in times of conflict. And these are not fringe conventions. They happen to be the one set of rules that all states accept and agree to. We have 196 states party to the Geneva Conventions. They have all ratified these rules. But these rules need to be enforced. And this is why a coalition of 6 states, including South Africa, China, Brazil, France, and others, have recently launched a high-level initiative which has a dedicated work stream to enhancing the application of IHL on the preservation of critical infrastructure. So our message at the FIX today is that public development banks and G20 finance ministers can and should leverage these rules to reduce the toll of war on critical civilian infrastructure. It's actually a very smart investment, and that has considerable benefits on health, climate, but also nature positive outcome. given the very constrained fiscal space in front of us, humanitarian organizations won't be afford to do water trucking or to send in generators that actually have a huge CO2 emission moving forward. And at the same time, public development banks won't be able to afford to see precious capital and development gains jeopardized every time conflict comes to an area.
Thank you so much, Olivier. I think great to see that actually there are positive news. I think it is important to, it was also mentioned in the President's keynote, things are happening, but I think we need to better share those and replicate those and scale those and enforce where possible the binding rules that are out there. So I think there's a clear action item here, what needs to happen in order to really make sure that they are scaled. So thanks so much for sharing that, and I would love actually to hear some of the examples that you mentioned of these smart investments again, which are important. But Hoon, let me come to you again. AIIB clearly leading in this space. So it would be great to understand how the bank actually is planning to embed all these planetary health recommendation considerations into its infrastructure investments and lending.
Thank you for the question. So I'm speaking from investment operations point of view. So what is, Eric, planetary health? Okay, so to me, planetary health is the same, means the same thing like a sustainable investment, right? But I think here it gives more insight. What does it mean? So to me, it means it is a shift. It is shift from the siloed, isolated, reactive response to more proactive, multi-sectoral response. This we all know from, we discussed this approach during COVID-19. We all know the problems of our responses to COVID-19, and suddenly we woke up and, oh, by the way, we have such a concept like One Health. We should introduce and implement it. Yeah, but even before COVID-19, we talked about it, but we never did it. That is why COVID-19 happened. And after COVID-19, I mean, this awareness continues, which is good news. But how we can really put this into practice is a different matter. But there are some good positive signs. Like yesterday, there was a G20 discussion here. One of the top agenda was about the global health security discussion. What is encouraging is many countries' representatives sit together and discussing what we can do together. You know? Oh, this is a big, and WHO was there, and the plan was, and each country was committing. Even more encouraging to me was that finally the Finance Ministry and Ministry of Health are talking to each other. So I think there is some positive signs in that sense, and I think planetary health, proactive, multi-sector approach is good. Now, to me, how to embed the planetary health into our investment or project design. So, I mean, Eric a lot talk about nature-based solutions and all that, but I've been working on this as an infrastructure man last many 30 years. I didn't quite believe it, how to do it, you know. But I believe it can be done because of my failure. So last year, I visited India, one of the mega port. Same port facility I visited 7 years ago, $1 billion project. And then in the end, we had to drop the project because of environmental and social impact. So I revisited to open a business for this time, AIIB. But in the meantime, the government, without me knowing, government has completely redesigned the project by its own, maybe with some help from think tank and all that. It has become a so-called nature-based solution project. Less concrete walls, more wetland and all these things, you know. And the project was given entirely to private sector with some government incentives. So I realized that, oh, things can be really done in this way. And maybe us, the infrastructure people, we really need to learn from, work with Eric and how we can do this. And then at the moment, I'm also working on some climate adaptation project, water project in one of the country. And then I am I'm learning myself. Okay, even the gray infrastructure, it is a water resource project, for instance, like check dams or diversion canals. If this gray infrastructure, if they can be integrated into the concept of a bigger ecosystem, it can be considered as a nature-based solution. So whole this report, I think, is a good thing. So people like us, my colleague, it's an opportunity to change our perspective and look at the same thing differently. We must do it because whole incentive and pricing structure has changed. What was not economically, financially viable before, now it is viable. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Clearly a learning process, I think, as you said, from, both the concept was, the One Health concept, but how do you actually implement it? It's great to have. So really how to walk the dog, and then how to learn from Eric. What is the economic case for actually doing it, and learning from others who are doing it. So I think kind of just becoming more clear about what are the opportunities here, which brings me to you, Eric. You are here to teach us all what is the economic case for really integrating health and nature into infrastructure development. So over to you.
Thank you. I'm actually much more here to learn in this very interesting setting of the FIX and the G20 and so on. But before I start, I just want to give a big shout out to our team, who all of them could not be here. They're watching online now from Beijing, and JP acknowledged them before. And thank you also, Vera and JP, for leading this effort. And as I said, this is not just, we were very keen to launch this report here, because I think it is exactly this context of the different financial institutions, the multilateral development banks, the national development banks, the private sector financial institutions come together, and I think that's where things can really happen. And of course, there are also all these NGOs and civil society organizations that we learn from and that allows us to produce these kind of products. But I want to emphasize, this is not just another research product. I have a life behind me as an academic as well. This is very different. This is not also maybe not really a think tank project, because this is a product that is very much, as Hun was saying, developing in an organization that is, everyone. We are lean, as the president said, and we are very close to operations and follow what happens in operation. Is this third in a sequence of reports that have interacted with insights from the bank, looking at first climate policy and the specific challenges that emerging and developing countries have, often with limited state capacity, how to use that state capacity. We had the Nature's Infrastructure report, and now this report on infrastructure for planetary health. And this report evolved very much along with the process of formulating a health strategy for the bank. So a lot of learning back and forth, and how can we as an institution really have an impact in the health sector. And it's also now starting to affect because other aspects. We are traditionally a project bank, but since last summer we can do a policy-based loan for climate. And of course, we know that the impact of our projects in renewables, for example, rely a lot on the policy environment. So having that additional tool is very important. But it also allows us to actually apply this planetary health perspectives. And in conversations that we are having now, with, for example, with Brazil and with Bangladesh about climate policy-based financing, we are trying to integrate this planetary health. So encourage conversations between finance ministries and health ministries, between finance ministries and forestry ministries in Brazil, for example, to really integrate nature and health into climate policy. And of course, infrastructure is the gateway. Infrastructure, is something that we we do it, and it lasts often for decades. And so important that we get it right when we do it. And by integrating these features and thinking of infrastructure as the way to address global challenges, looking at the upside of infrastructure, not just the downside, how we can minimize the damage, really see how can we actually address pollution, how can we restore nature, how can we use infrastructure for this. And you heard our messages, we can invest in the health sector, making it more resilient, less carbon footprint and so on. We can integrate across different infrastructure areas that we invest in water, energy, transport, digital. We can invest in nature as infrastructure. And here's where it comes very important, I think, that we have talked about how poor people cannot protect themselves while rich people can protect themselves against the impact of climate and nature. That's why it's so important that we are actually not investing anywhere. We are investing in emerging and developing countries where this impact from collective solutions to these problems are effective, and where people cannot protect themselves. And my last point is that we talk about how we can use climate and nature to mobilize resources for human health. But what I think may be even more important is that it's by emphasizing the health impacts that we can mobilize resources for climate action and resources for nature, turning around loss of biodiversity and nature degradation. So these are incredibly important, and we know that air pollution has been one of the major drivers of climate action in much of Asia, and we need to use this possibility. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Eric, for teaching us more, but not only. I think this, as you said, I think this is a really concrete report and really concrete recommendations which are based on actions and your experiences. I think so important the fact that you had around making sure that you have this collaboration across all actors, that you actually as an MDB can enable also these conversations amongst ministries that hadn't happened before, as Hoon also said. But I think similar to what Maria said, just this focus on upside, on the co-benefits, on really thinking how we can emphasize the health impact to mobilize resources for climate and nature. But Maria, let me come back to you. I think certainly the mobilizing the resources, financial resources, is important. Integrating health, climate, and nature into infrastructure finance is essential, but we continue to hear about the perception of high risks in these types of investment, and I'd love to hear from you whether you have any ideas or priorities of what needs to happen in order to kind of reduce this perception of risks, maybe with some experience from Latin America particularly.
Yeah, I think the question is how we start tangibilizing and having more clarity about what the risks means, and this means also having tools and ways for decision making. Sometimes I think the difficulty is when we talk about the risks in a very generic manner, investors or a Lord Mayor or a decision maker can not really grasp it. So I think there is a work to be done in terms of having tools that can understand what are the kinds of, let's say, environmental risks that have an interlinkage to the local region, and then what are the kinds of tools we also help to do this, what I was saying, this cost-benefit analysis and this integrated planning approach. So if we are able to tangibilize it to the asset level, to the level of projects, of what this means in a local level, this may help a lot to then define what is the kind of financial mechanism or intervention that we need to do, no? And that's the tricky thing. We were discussing, I'm sorry to be mentioning CDRI, but I was just discussing about that this week, and we were precisely thinking that you probably need different layers even of decision-making. There is the decision-making on the fiscal level. So how are governments planning their infrastructure, thinking about here, about this idea that's not just about the infrastructure being resilient, but is the solution integrated? How is the fiscal and budget planning happening at the higher level? But then when you come at the local level, what are the specific decisions you have to take if you are deciding to do some project in a specific location, and how this relates to these interlinkages, no? And just to say, we talked about here a lot of heat waves. There was also this talk about the nature. If I look, for example, in Brazil, in Latin America, a lot of the populations that were very affected by the dryness and the fires, for example, were poor, very subsistence level populations in the Amazon. And the effect is huge because it has an ecosystem impact. It's not just about the moment of dryness, it's that the fishes and the river and the whole environment where these people had a way of living changes and requires rethinking the adaptive capacity of these people. We maybe never thought about needing to have, for example, access to water and sanitation in the Amazon, but that is one of the biggest problems for the populations living in the Amazon today. So this rethinking of infrastructure, and also again, what is the impact of this further on the health of the people there? We had this catastrophe last year in Brazil of Yanomamis dying of actually, hunger, and this is Brazil. So I think this really needs a serious thinking in terms of systematic way. But as you were saying, we also need to be pragmatic in having tools and things that help the planning and decision making.
Great, thank you so much, Maria. I think some very concrete thoughts on what needs to happen. And I think in the same vein, Olivier, let me come to you. You obviously have lots of experience in the areas, the regions you work with, the need for infrastructure resilience. And I'd love to hear more coming to the point of partnerships or innovative models, if there's anything you can share that could also help to scale what works and replicate it in other areas.
Sure. So we call that humanitarian blended finance, but never mind the word. I want to take you to Goma today, which is home to 2 million people, as you know, and over 600,000 internally displaced people. Now, a month ago, when combats hit the city, they also hit the electricity lines, shutting off electricity to the main hospital in the city, to the water pumps, etc. So, of course, as humanitarians, what the ACRC did was come in with generators to support the power system in the hospital, because there were teams of surgeons dealing with the influx of patients, but also we did the traditional water trucking because that was the life-saving measure. But we didn't stop here, and we shouldn't stop here. We also worked as a neutral humanitarian intermediary to help the engineers of the electricity utilities company cross the front lines to be able to repair the electricity lines to make sure that not only the hospital, but 70% of the city regained access to electricity. Now, that is fundamental because humanitarian action 2.0 is no longer about just the generators and the water trucking. It's fundamentally about looking at the system and the resilience, even at the most complex shocks that we have to deal with, which is conflict. And it actually works, but it wouldn't have worked had we not been working for about a decade with a number of development banks to address the chronic lack of water supply in the city of Goma. And so we need to become more clever collectively and more experienced to have these responsible handover strategies between public development banks, IFIs, humanitarian actors, to be able to respond to these this shifting landscape. Now, if I have another minute, I'd love to tell you about how working in Lebanon with a public development bank has also helped us to ensure the resilience of the public health system faced with a number of shocks. So traditionally, we realized that we were coming in and out of a hospital with our surgeons every time there was a peak of violence in the region. Now, we went for an alternative approach, which is to work with the Public Development Bank on the resilience of the hospital. That's training, but that's also installing solar panel, isolation, etc. And A few years later, the Minister of Health told us that without that project, the whole health system of Lebanon would have been severely impacted by COVID, by the Beirut port explosion, or for that matter, by the mass casualty events that we've seen recently, just across the street from the hospital in the southern suburbs of Beirut. So this is not theory, that's a practice of leveraging the comparative advantages of public development banks who have long-term capital, capacity to build and sustain capabilities in the system, but also humanitarian actors who stay engaged and remain present throughout even the most complex of conflict situations. So there is a model there, but it can and should be scaled, and that's the message that I'd like us to walk away with. IFIs can not only de-risk investments in fragile settings, but also prevent the collapse of whole systems and thereby prevent the development reversals that we've seen. That requires that they stay engaged, and as neutral humanitarian actors, we can help them do so because we are in constant dialogue with those very parties to the conflict today.
Very good. Again, I love the focus on concrete examples that work and what can be scaled, but also this, I think, important point to stay engaged. It's not just come in and come out, finance something, but really make sure that there is like a continued, almost a change and shift in how you engage and how you partner across different actors. So thanks so much for this. But let me come back to you. Again, obviously AIB focusing on large-scale infrastructure. How are you balancing, again, coming back to a little bit, balancing this priority of planetary health with your economic growth priorities and like the overarching goal of being a green bank?
So thank you very much again for the important question. So as an infrastructure banker, I believe it's very important to be open about both the opportunities and also the risks come from large-scale infrastructure project. On the one hand, this mega infrastructure, big or small even, are engines of economic growth. We need them. That is the development. On the other hand, the choices we make, where to build it, and how to build it, and what materials we will use, this can negatively impact the natural surroundings and local communities. So that is where multilateral development banks have responsibility, and we have policies and frameworks to I mean, all this discussion, international forum, this come back as into our policy. So only then we adapt it and we improve ourselves. So I'd like to talk about this nature in particular. So, you know, valuation, for us to make an action, the valuation of the scarce resources like a nature ecosystem is very important. That is where, again, the job of Eric comes. So we do what is called, when we design an infrastructure project, at least we give 30-year economic life. And we do typically economic analysis, yeah, cost and benefit. So how you define the cost? How you define, that makes bank project more economically viable or not. If it's financial project, it's very simple. You know, the cash generation, all that. But we are doing infrastructure project, public sector project, economic viability. So that is the analytical framework, valuation, very important. And having said that, I like to compare the case of climate and also the case of nature approach. Now, climate, the debate has gone much advanced. So we have metric there. We calculate as much as possible GHG, you know, and we take into account, and we also measure how much reduction we make. Every project, we have a climate specialist do all this job. Nature, not yet. So nature, first of all, we don't really have a metric. Valuation, I already mentioned. But there was resilience project in a concept, but what actually is doing it in energy, how to make our main financing modality using different analytical framework, different valuation, so that design of our project can further change and improve it. At the same time, we'll continuously work on innovative finance. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I do have to say, I do think innovative finance can get you to scale at some point. I think you need to experiment, but I think there are ways of being more creative with some of the financial structures and solutions. So I will be looking very closely at what you will be developing. Absolutely, no, that's fantastic. But Eric, let me come back to you. Again, we've heard a lot about the importance of working with governments, with private sector. How can an MDB like AIIB do that in order to really foster this integration of health and climate nature into infrastructure planning?
I think we can do a lot to articulate these impacts much more clearly. I said at the end of my previous intervention that it's a lot about building the case for why health impact should be part of what we consider when we do infrastructure investments. So it's not just about making sure that there is no negative health or minimizing negative health impact, but really using infrastructure to look at how can we actually address air pollution, how can we address the spread of pandemic diseases and so on. I just want to reiterate a few of the examples that have been mentioned here, because I think it really tells you how I think you have to work with policymakers. The vulture example from India was mentioned. Over 5 years, 100,000 people every year died because of the loss of these keystone species. And the calculations have been done how much that cost in terms of deaths, but also in terms of illness in the Indian economy. You look at this example we had from these kind of very dramatic stops to economic activity in New Delhi, and 2% loss in infant mortality, increased birth weights. These are very real things I think for policymakers. We have some work on AMR. AMR, if it continues as we have done so far, we lose maybe 2 years life expectancy across most of the countries in Asia. We look at lead poisoning. I remember participating in a conversation in Ulaanbaatar where every third child has detectable signs of lead poisoning because of the combination of air pollution and inversion and so on. And as I didn't know before we started this work, but lead never leaves your skeleton. It's there forever. If you have it, as a young, it's with you. And we know that this is something. So I think these are the kind of examples and sort of the role that I think I see for us in producing these kind of reports, really reminding ourselves and Hun and I talk about this a lot. How we can really, how can we directly impact? So he mentioned a couple of examples. So we had a project or still have a project in our pipeline. It's a flood management project in Inner Mongolia. And that project is about using the restoration of a wetland to manage floods in this city. That project, once we start, let's not just do conventional cost-benefit analysis. Let's do a cost-benefit analysis that really takes natural capital seriously. And we didn't need any additional information because all the information we needed was there in the environmental assessment. We looked at that, and once you start taking into account all the other benefits that this wetland has in terms of carbon capture, in terms of cross-pollination, air pollution, water pollution, recreation, mental health, start incorporating that in the analysis that the government has to make, and it always makes. Every infrastructure investment with the government has this kind of assessment. Once we start to expand how we think about it, the clear view what this wetland restoration should be made significantly larger because of those values. So I think that's how we have to work. It's true that we are in this space still struggling a bit with metrics, but I think we have made a lot of progress, and we have, I would say we have several metrics, and even using only one of them is helpful, and we need to make progress on that. The final thing I would say is that the way we have talked about it, and I think that's exactly how I think the bank should approach it, is that, you know, we had a climate action plan a couple of years ago. Let's look at that climate action plan now, you know, with having this experience of thinking through nature's infrastructure, thinking through what we do in the whole infrastructure space related to planetary health, and then say, this is how we can sort of incrementally improve our climate action by integrating these features. And I'm very convinced that, you know, we will make progress on this with all our bank colleagues. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So thank you so much to all my panelists. Let me just very briefly actually come back to the key recommendations of the report: accessible, green, inclusive, and resilient healthcare infrastructure, health, nature, climate in all infrastructure, and nature infrastructure for health. I think this panel here has given some very good indications, suggestions on how those recommendations can be rolled out, can be implemented, what are lessons from various parts of the ecosystem. In doing so, I think what I've heard is that we certainly need this holistic, this integrated approach, how infrastructure can be more resilient and how infrastructure itself becomes part of the solution, as Maria said. I think for that we need this systemic perspective, we need impacts, KPIs, more holistic KPIs, focus on the upsides. And I think, again, in this context, just having a cost-benefit analysis that takes natural capital seriously. We're not yet fully there. We work a lot on data, we know that, but I think this is something where lots of work is going on, and hopefully something where we can make some progress in the near future. We also need more granularity. We need more clarity on the risks. We need clear tools that highlight risks, but also that are here, tools for planning and for decisions making. We need financial solutions, replicate the ones that are actually working. There are examples out there to get to scale, but then also innovate to get to better integration of nature, health, and climate into infrastructure finance, and hopefully at some point also to scale there. We need clearly collaboration partnerships, I think leverage the comparative advantages of everyone and then stay engaged, as Olivier said. But I want to end just by saying we've heard across the panel here encouraging news. There is a movement into the right direction. We hear the news from G20 where health and finance ministries are finally talking. We hear about projects that are working. So I think let's also stay on the positive news and make sure that we replicate what works and build on those efforts and do more in the context of learning from each other and in terms of knowledge sharing. So let me thank my panel and AIIB for having us here and for an excellent report again. Thanks, everyone.